Do we need to deprivatise the internet? Do we need to take the internet into public ownership? What does that even mean, and what does that look like? Those are some of the questions I'm hoping to get a better understanding of, a better grasp of, and better answers to by reading this book. Internet for the People, The Fight for Our Digital Future by Ben Tarnoff. So this is a book I picked up at the very tail end of 2023 in the Verso annual festive sale. And when I first showed it to you on this channel, I mentioned the possibility of recording a reading vlog for it, which at least some of you seemed interested in, so that's what we're here to do. Now, I don't believe I've ever recorded a reading vlog specifically dedicated to a non-fiction title before, so I don't know exactly what this video is going to look like, but I'm excited to take you along with me on this journey because I think it's going to be really interesting to discuss the subject of this book and the contents of this book with you and my experience of reading it as I go along with it. In fact, if anything, I think probably non-fiction suits the reading vlog format more than any other genre. So I thought I would start off this video, which I have no idea the future of, with a little bit of an introduction to the topic, a discussion about what I think this book's going to be about, what I'm expecting from this book, and where I'm at the moment. I literally started this book this morning and I'm only about 10 pages into the preface so far, so obviously I haven't gotten into the meat of the matter, but so far I'm enjoying the writing style and finding it accessible. I actually lent this book to my mum already, who read it at the very beginning of 2024, who also said that it's very accessible, and neither of us are like big technology buffs, so I think that's worth mentioning here. Like, I use the internet, I exist on and spend time on the internet, but it's certainly not my areas of expertise. In fact, I can't think of a subject potentially further from my area of expertise than this, being that I'm an ancient historian. But I do have a partner who is an engineering and computer science grad, so I do sometimes get little tidbits from him, and I expect I'm probably going to be asking him some questions whilst I read this book, if I'm being perfectly honest. I actually already sent him a text message this morning asking him about the fact that these like cables or wires or what have you, which are major components of the internet and the transfer of data, are located at the bottom of the sea. And although it didn't strike me as entirely new information, it certainly wasn't something I'd thought about much. And his immediate reaction was, oh yeah, sharks sometimes nibble on them, which, there you go, there's a tidbit of information I picked up. But the topic of this book is obviously not just what is the internet or a history of the internet, although that's how it's started off. It's a book about why the internet needs to be deprivatized, at least in the author's opinion, what that might look like and how we might go about it. In the 80s, the internet was something that was owned, generally speaking, by governments. And I imagine that this will be the shape the author argues for it to exist again in the future, a little bit like with a lot of the public services that I myself as a socialist and others would argue should be deprivatised and taken into public ownership. For example, you know, rail services, any public transport really, electricity, gas, phone companies, all of which I believe and other socialists believe should be owned and run for and by the people, which means coming under government ownership. They shouldn't be run for profit. They should be run as public necessities to the best advantage they can be. And I have to say, I've never really considered prior to this point the fact that the internet might be something that is owned by the public. I have in the past campaigned for and argued for the public ownership of broadband, which is obviously a component of the internet. It's something very much related to the internet in the fact that it's how we all access the internet. And what's really interesting is I remember having this conversation back in what was probably like 2018, 2019, I'd imagine, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party here in the UK, with friends about the public ownership of broadband, because that was one of Jeremy Corbyn and Labour at the time's campaigns. That was something that they had in their manifesto, that if they were elected into government, they would bring broadband into public ownership, making it cheaper for people to access and making sure everybody had access to it. And in my conversations with others around this, and I don't just mean with people who are completely on the opposite side of the political spectrum from me, but people who generally believe in the same things that I do, who are also left-wing, every now and then some of them would say to me they didn't understand the importance of this, or they didn't understand why it was a priority for Labour or Jeremy Corbyn, or why it was something that should be a focus or even a part of the manifesto. Like, why did it matter? And it was always something I argued for the importance of, which I then think was very well proven, unfortunately, by the subsequent pandemic. So again, looking at the UK, we lived through a time in which anybody who could was in their home. They weren't able to go into schools or universities or their jobs. And in order to continue those jobs, that education, what have you, they required access to the internet. But, and I think this is something you don't consider if you've always had easy access to the internet, you've never had an issue keeping up with your bills for broadband, is that not everybody does have access to the internet in their home. Still, a lot of people don't. Their only access to internet might be in their universities, it might be in their schools, it might be in the local library, it might be in their workplace. And it meant that those who didn't have access to broadband and the internet at home, usually those from lower income families, were suddenly cut off from the rest of the world. They didn't have the same access to and ability to complete their studies and to interact with the school curriculum, in particular if you're looking at younger people who don't have any control over these things in their household. And suddenly this conversation was brought up again, and suddenly this conversation came up again about and suddenly this topic of the public ownership and publicly accessible broadband came up again, and more people were on the side of it being so, because in this day and age, although there are people who live without the internet and manage to live without the internet, it is an integral part of how we exist in countries like the UK, how these countries are run, how people apply for jobs, how people apply for benefits, how people get access to information, how people communicate with others and make sure they're not isolated. It can connect us to so many things. So it's a really important thing, right? Not just for like watching silly videos on YouTube like this one. It's something that's an integral part of our existence. And therefore, like with any other important integral part of our existence, like gas and electricity and homes and transport, etc., I would obviously argue it should be under public ownership. But this book goes further than that. It's obviously not just about broadband. It's also about like the internet itself, the servers that the internet exists on, the websites, the companies that supply all of like the basis of these stacks of information. You know, so much of the internet is owned by recognizable companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft, etc. And they have a stake in what the internet accomplishes and what the internet looks like, because it garners them profit. Now, this is something I don't understand to a terribly detailed degree, but I'm hoping I will understand to a better and more in-depth degree through reading this book and talking about it with all of you. And I'd love to hear about your thoughts as you're watching this video and as I'm discussing the topics. But obviously, like I said, exist on the internet. I think it's a space that can be both wonderful and useful and positive, like books like Freedom is a Constant Struggle demonstrate, but it can also be a cesspool, a cesspit of horrors and a microcosm of all the terrible parts of our society, like books like Not All Dead White Men demonstrate. But just like society, it can kind of be anything we want it to be. And from the first few pages of this book, not only have I learned a little bit about the history and the structure of the internet, but I've also, I feel, got a better understanding of the author's overarching thesis, which is we can choose to make the internet what we want it to be. We just have to choose together. So I'm excited to see what his vision of that is, but I enjoy the positive message that is, you know, we can do it, because you've got to believe it, don't you? So yeah, I'm looking forward to reading this book and learning from it and discussing it with you, but I can't do that without getting into it. So without further ado, let's crack on with the reading portion, shall we? Side note, because this video is in the vlog style, I've decided to start it off as I mean to continue, which is filming on my phone. Let's get on with it. This book presents a few directions for doing so. It calls for shrinking the space of the market and diminishing the power of the profit motive. It calls for developing models of public and cooperative ownership that encode the principles of collective governance and popular participation. but the scale and complexity of the internet mean there is no silver bullet for creating a democratic digital future. It will require much experimentation. It will also require creating new structures that enable such experiments to take place. The outcome of these experiments can't be known in advance, which is why the suggestions in the subsequent pages are necessarily provisional. The precise contours of a democratic internet can only be discovered through a democratic process, through people coming together to build the world they want. Outside of the deprivatization thesis, this book is making me realise how many silly little things about the online world and the internet I did not really consider, think about or know, including the fact that the web and the internet are not the same thing. I filmed that clip and then literally a sentence later, the book says... many newcomers would come to know the internet primarily through the web, to the point where people had trouble distinguishing between the two. I am predictable. I am like the other girls. Is this not exactly what I was talking about in the introduction to this video? We're in a discussion about broadband and people's access to broadband, and it has got into the topic of the COVID-19 crisis, because this is quite a recent book, which the book describes as greatly magnified those disadvantages. As lockdowns and social distancing pushed more people's lives online, a decent home internet connection became all the more essential. In response, the many millions of Americans without one flocked to the parking lots of schools, libraries and other institutions that continued to offer free Wi-Fi. There they sat in their cars for hours, working from home, attending online classes, applying for unemployment, chatting with friends and loved ones. But not everyone could make it to the parking lot. Memorise these words. Broadband is like water and electricity now, and yet it is still being treated like a luxury. So I have just got done finishing the first part of Internet for the People. In fact, how many parts are there? Is it 3 or 4? But there are only 2 parts. Okay, so I finished the first part. It's certainly not half of the book, but I finished the first part of this book, which is a bit more of a history of the internet. So I thought I'd reflect on it in my state of having just read it before I get into the next section, which is titled, not prepared at all, that's not the title, that's just me, the platforms. So part 1 was pipes, then we have the platforms. So yeah, there's like a little bit of a history of the internet in there, and like a breakdown of some of the components of how the internet works and is run. Do I feel as though I have a degree's worth of knowledge in this area now? No. Am I an expert? No. Do I have a ton of questions about how the internet works? Yes. But do I feel like I was in any way excluded from the content that the author was talking about? No. I felt like I could follow what his overarching thesis was and what he was trying to impart on me as the reader. I found it very readable, so that was really great. And I think there's nothing wrong with, in fact, there's something really good about coming away from a non-fiction book with more questions. Not questions that the book had tried to answer, that's maybe not so great, but questions expanding on the book that were never really the intention of the book to teach you. So I do have a lot of questions regarding that, but in terms of the actual content of the book, I really feel like it's doing its job. And it's been really interesting because obviously it talks a little bit about the history going back to kind of the invention of the servers, I guess, that the internet is based on, which were originally owned by governments. And this book is very, very specifically about the USA, in part because, you know, you've got to narrow down your focus and sort of focus in on one place or one element, a case study, shall we say, for a book as short as this, but also because a lot of the big companies are US based, although it has made me curious about sort of UK providers and what the differences might be, but also like what models there are in the UK, because one of the things he talks about in the history is more community run internet in local areas in the US, like places that's names Chattanooga. Chattanooga was one of his examples of community led internet. But yeah, so he talks a little bit about the internet's history, sort of going back to it being owned by the government and then it being run for the military, and then how it was privatised predominantly in the 90s and sold off to private companies to be run for profit. How like easily that happened, like how just like swiftly it happened, how there were some attempts to maybe create more regulations, but how those opportunities were missed, and capitalism really won out on that one and just like swept in and took it all away, to be run for profit, not for people, which is capitalism. So it's really kind of depressing to think that things could have gone really differently if the kind of political ideology at the time had been for something different. But yeah, so that was really interesting. And then it obviously becomes very private as it becomes more expansive and more accessible. But at the same time as it becoming a bigger part of all of our lives, it still continues to be very inaccessible in a way that I sort of touched on at the beginning of this video, just based on my own knowledge. And it was really interesting when he talked about examples that very much related to my feelings, as it were, on broadband existing. And he actually talked about Bernie Sanders having very similar sort of policy hopes during his run for presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, as I think what I talked about with Jeremy Corbyn earlier on. So that's just really interesting to obviously see the parallels between two different countries. And then he talks about these smaller community-based internet servers that are run more for the people. But at the same time, so that's him talking about sort of how it can be done positively. But at the same time as him obviously being complimentary of these like well-run local versions, it's not enough, is it? Like the internet is something that connects us all beyond our local areas and internationally, so it also needs to sort of function for people, not profit, on a countrywide and global wide basis, which is obviously like a big ask, but it's good to know what we're aiming for, right? So that's just interesting to hear about like successful examples of the internet being run not for profit, and maybe how we can take inspiration from that to be done on a larger scale, which would involve governments being involved. But yeah, I just feel like so far it's been interesting in terms of history. I feel like I've been introduced his overarching thesis, like I mentioned, and I enjoy the way that the author does sort of touch on different political theories, political theorists and philosophers, and kind of use their socialist left-wing approaches to the internet and show the relevancy of those things. But that's something that I think you'd have to read the book to interact with, but in a way, again, where I don't feel like it's excluding anybody, like it's not requiring you to have any familiarity or have read about these people before, but I like how he situates it in a wider school of political thought, if that makes sense, because it's all tied up with one another. So yeah, I'm finding it really interesting so far. Just educational, interesting. I don't know if that's covering all my bases, but I've still got a chunk of it to read, because even though that's the first part, it's not the first half. So I'll be checking in now and then as I read part 2. Okay, so I have a bit of a cold and I'm taking a sick day. This is what we're working with. But I still wanted to talk a little bit about internet for the people before I read any more of it. Companies like Facebook, Google, social media, and the rise of what some term surveillance capitalism. So the author actually talks about another book which is all about surveillance capitalism, which I actually have. Like, I have this book, I have the audiobook of this book, and I still haven't listened to it, and I really need to. I think it's because it's quite a chunky book. I've been a bit intimidated, but what with it now being referred to in this book, I'm like extra eager to get to it. So it's talking about that book, which is talking about how most of how a lot of companies make money or make a profit online is by capturing data, which they then sell to advertisers. And one of the examples it obviously talks about is Google, which is the sort of like apex predator, as the book describes, Internet for the People describes, of this area of the internet. So conceptually, Google obviously started as a search engine that was meant to make using the growing internet world easier, that could, you know, filter search results, direct people to what they were looking for, like go through all of that sort of information, like process that information. I don't understand the technicalities of it, but you know, it processed all this information so it could give you the best results. But then they started obviously selling advertising spots, and as you know, if you use Google, like often the top results you get are advertisements. They do say they're advertisements, but more and more I think that indication that they are ads is kind of like smaller and smaller, so you don't necessarily think about it when you're using the platform. So it in turn is selling the data that it's collecting on people's searches and what they're clicking through to in order to make themselves a good platform for advertisers to use, and advertisers use that data. But then at the same time, none of that is natural data, is it? Because it almost becomes like some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. They're still influencing what people are searching for and clicking through, which then in turn influences what they sell to advertisers, and advertisers sell on their platform and what they think people want. But what they think people want is influenced by what they've told people they want, and it's all like a little bit messy and not exactly like genuine. But we're all part of like that cycle. Like that's how it is to exist online in this day and age, where the internet is dominated by capitalism and profit. I mean, there was ads at the beginning of this video, I'm sure, because, you know, I've got a mortgage to pay and I'm just like a random content creator who exists within this system. It's obviously really interesting to think about, and it's always really good to be aware of. And it makes me think a lot about TikTok, because I feel like TikTok is a real like hyper sped up version of some of the development of advertising that we've seen online in the past few decades, because it's constantly adapting its platform specifically to make it suitable for advertisements. And one of the most recent changes that people are talking about on TikTok is the fact that they're now going to be promoting horizontal videos, a little bit like on YouTube, which would be longer format and compete with YouTube, but also to give them more space for advertising. And it's just, it all happens very, very quickly, and you can see it happen, and then it influences the content we make, because everyone constantly is talking about the algorithm and what TikTok wants from us. How long should our videos be? What kind of videos should they be in order for them to get seen? Because we want our content to be seen because we're creating stuff. And then it's influenced by what TikTok is telling us to do. So it's all, as much as we try not to be like sucked into it, it's all still partly influenced by it. Even if you're trying not to be influenced by it, you are being influenced by it by actively trying not to be, if that makes sense. So it's just interesting, obviously, to think about. But I also thought it was interesting that in one way, the author Ben Tarnoff disagrees with The Rise of Surveillance Capitalism, the book, is the idea that advertisements are sort of like a form of mind control, because he talks about the fact that other scholars have pointed to the like lack of sort of attention and lack of engagement in advertising. So while a platform like Google or Facebook might want to almost sell themselves as mind control to an advertiser, like, yeah, we can make people buy your product, does it actually work? Because more and more people are so attuned to this advertising that they just sort of like switch off and they don't engage with it, and they don't they don't engage with it. Which is, again, why I think like platforms are constantly trying to like rewrite how they do things, like TikTok, because they're trying to like mind control us. Like, that sounds like a conspiracy theory when I say like that, but I'm sure you know what I mean. Advertising is a form of mind control, right? Like in a very, very like in a very, very like peculiar way. That is kind of what it's trying to do, at least, you know, it's trying to influence us. So he argues that actually like all this advertising space that's being sold isn't necessarily actually as effective as companies wish to make advertisers believe who are giving them the money. So like, I don't really know the data, and I don't think it's explored enough in depth in this book for me to like fall on either side of it, but I do think it's an interesting thought and something interesting to think about, and I can absolutely see that. Like, do I click on banner ads? No, not really. Do I even watch YouTube pre-roll ads? Sometimes I let them roll, especially if it's a creator I like and I want them to like sort of get the ad revenue. But do I click on them? No. Do I necessarily absorb what they're telling me? No. Although I could in some ways be absorbing it subconsciously. So I don't know. That's just my like personal biased experience. But it's just making the point, really, isn't it? That like, a lot of how the internet functions and a lot of the ways that we use the internet is based in profit, which of course we know. And he is drawing on the metaphor of a shopping mall. And what I didn't know was really interesting is that the original like mall, American mall, was actually founded by like a socialist immigrant to the US who wanted to create like a community space. So it wouldn't just be shops, it would be restaurants, it would be places for people to meet, for people to do things, which obviously people still do in malls, but it became something beyond that and became obviously a much more like profit driven machine, especially in terms of like rental spaces to companies. So that's really interesting, and you can kind of see how that metaphor works with the internet, because like a lot of these platforms that we use are like founded and based in sort of like social aspirations where we form communities, but then they become driven by profit. Changing that is obviously more complicated than acknowledging that, but it's interesting and it's good to think about, I think. So yeah, just thought I'd summarize what I'd sort of been reading, I guess. So I'm actually planning on finishing this book this afternoon, but I wanted to just chat a little bit about something specific whilst it was on my mind, because for the last few pages or chapters even, this book has spent a great deal of time talking about Uber, which is a company that if I didn't hate before, I certainly hate now. And when I say hate Uber, I do not mean I hate Uber employees or contractors or drivers. I mean Uber the company, because Uber is the kind of company that massively takes advantage of the people it calls contractors, but are employees that just don't get paid a minimum wage. And now I'm learning, which I didn't even know before, that Uber literally doesn't turn a profit. The only reason people make money from profit from Uber is basically through investing in it and investing shares that they then take out once they've accrued more value, a value that like literally doesn't exist. It's gambling, it's stocks, it's a world that I cannot fathom and think is absolutely ludicrous, absurd, and the epitome of why capitalism is a cesspit. So yeah. If you didn't know that, Uber literally doesn't turn a profit. It makes money through investment and people investing in it. It doesn't make money through Uber Eats or Uber taxis, although they don't technically call themselves a taxi company, because if they called themselves a taxi company, they would be forced to adhere to certain employer standards that they're not forced to employ, they're not forced to adhere to legally, because they're not a taxi company, they're an internet company, which also I think like highlights some of the issues with lack of regulations and laws and understanding of quickly evolving technology. But more generally, what the second part of the book has been talking about is more of like the platforms and the companies that use the internet, right, and have profited from the internet, like Uber, and that's one example. But it's also talked about like Amazon and Facebook and Google, which I touched on earlier, and I'll probably reflect a little bit more on all of that once I've finished the book. But I wanted to go on my little rant about Uber there whilst it was in my mind, because like I said, if I didn't already hate them, I hate them more now. Back to reading. So I'm actually just making dinner, and I thought I would use this as an opportunity to catch up / finalise my thoughts on this reading vlog. So I finished the book, and I do think part of the processing or learning from the book is going to be the kind of time you sit with it afterwards, like with a lot of non-fiction books in particularly, and discussing it with other people, and also further reading. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't think this is a bad thing, but I definitely have come away with a lot of questions and areas of curiosity that have arisen or been like fanned by this book, because obviously it covers a lot, and it's 180 pages, excluding endnotes. So it's a short book, and it covers a lot, and it introduces you to a lot, and I feel like I've learned a lot, but I also have a ton of questions, and it does cite and source a lot of other journalists and books in there, so I definitely have some more reading to do based on that. I already mentioned The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, another book that was in the latter part of it. Another book that was in the latter part of this book was Algorithms of Oppression, which is another one I've wanted to read for a little while, which is all about how, well, algorithms can contribute to oppression through sort of how bad they are, like how they're set up and draw from existing oppressive systems and biases, and then continue to further those. Again, I need to read the book to better understand that. Obviously, I only have a basic understanding, so I definitely want to read that and some other books that it's mentioned and explore a little bit more. But I think the second half in particular, like I said, really focused in on sort of those that are profiting, like the big companies that are profiting from the internet, and also examples of how they're doing that through showing you a few of those examples, like Uber. And I also mentioned Amazon, and I did want to mention that again because it does touch on Amazon and Amazon Web Services, although specifically one area of Amazon Web Services. And this is something I found really fascinating prior to reading this book, actually, that I'd had conversations with my partner about that I hadn't really been aware of. Now, I think we're all aware to some degree of the dominance of Amazon online. And also some of its like predatory tactics, like with book selling. If we're like big bookie people here, you might know about the fact that they don't really make any profit. They take a loss really on their book selling in order to dominate the book market and get people on their site. But I think what I didn't realise for a really long time was that, at least in the past few years, Amazon's most profitable area of business is their web services. So while we think of Amazon as an online shop more than anything, I think, like lots of people anyway, the way that they're like profiteering the most is really through their web services, which means that even if you avoid the Amazon site, if you don't buy anything from Amazon, Audible, Kindle, one of the many companies that they own, you're likely still using services that are contributing financially to Amazon, because so much of internet traffic goes through Amazon Web Services, and so many like online websites are based on Amazon Web Services because they own all this infrastructure, I guess. And that is something the book touched on. I don't think it went into too much detail about it, and it's something I'd like to read more about again, but it was something I found really interesting when I first learned about, so I thought I'd mention it here. And just generally the second half of the book just talks a lot about how private companies profit from the internet, how that negatively affects the spaces we occupy online, how obviously having these things run for profit isn't beneficial to community, and I got like a real history of that and a real better understanding of the technical side of that. I will say, for a book that's about the future of the internet, it doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the future except until the very end of the book, which is something I kind of anticipated. I think this happens a lot with books like this because they are introducing such a broad topic. Can they really cover everything? Can they propose all the solutions? Not that the book even says it sets out to propose all the solutions, it wants to be part of a conversation, but it is certainly not like, here's the manifesto for exactly what we need to do. It gives some suggestions at the end, but again, I feel like it's just part of a much wider kind of conversation. Like, I need to read more, I need to study more. I certainly agree with it. I think it was really positive in terms of like what I took away from it. I found it very educational. It seemed very well researched to me and very, like I said, very interesting.
but I also feel like I said there's a lot more for me to learn and think about. But I don't really know what else I can say in this video, and I'm also not sure what I've said in this video. Like, what have I said? Has it been interesting? I don't even know what random bits I picked out. I focused in on what I found interesting at the time and what I felt able to convey myself through my own words. Because obviously I'm not an expert in this, but I think there's a lot more to it, and I definitely think this book is worth a read. Like, I think most people could take something away from it. I find it quite accessible, and even that which you have more questions about, I think it just sort of like steers you in the direction you need to go to learn more, so that's really fantastic. And I overall, like I said, I enjoyed it. I hope for a better future for the internet, like Angela Davis, as is cited at the end of this book. I love that at the end of the book he talks about Angela Davis and I talked about Angela Davis briefly at the beginning of this video, so it all came back around. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the deprivatisation of the internet. Maybe any surprising facts you know about this area. I love learning more, and I'd also like to hear what you think about non-fiction reading vlogs. Obviously it's hard to entirely in-depth discuss a book with people when I'm not sure if everyone's read the book and I'm obviously just distilling parts of it based on what I've read, but hopefully it's still been interesting. And now that I think I've said everything I could possibly say, I'm just going to say read the book for yourself, and I'm going to get on with making tea. Until next time, happy reading. Bye everyone.